There's a country in Western Europe that has given the world its language of diplomacy, its concept of human rights, its obsession with food and philosophy, and also two of the bloodiest revolutions in recorded history. A land where kings were gods, where peasants became conquerors, where a short Corsican man rewrote the map of an entire continent, and where a baker's wife screaming outside a palace changed the course of civilization. This is not just a country, this is France. And this is the story of how one nation, through glory, bloodshed, genius, and collapse, shaped the modern world more than any other civilization in the last 12 centuries. We are about to compress 1,100 years of kings, revolutions, emperors, and republics into one extraordinary journey. And by the end, you will never see France the same way again. Before we begin, understand this central idea. France is the eternal tension between two forces, authority and liberty. Every king, every revolution, every war, every republic in French history is ultimately a battle between those who want to impose order and those who refuse to accept it. That tension never dies. It transforms, it explodes, it rebuilds, and it repeats. From Charlemagne's Iron Throne to Macron's Élysée Palace, the same question echoes across 12 centuries of French history. Who has the right to rule and what gives them that right? This is your emotional anchor. Keep it in your mind, because every chapter of this story, no matter how dramatic, is a variation of the same eternal French question. Long before France was France, this land was called Gaul, a vast territory of forests, rivers, and Celtic tribes who had lived here for thousands of years. The Gauls were not primitive barbarians, as Roman historians like to portray them. They were skilled ironworkers, fierce warriors, sophisticated traders, and deeply spiritual people who built complex social structures and worshipped in sacred groves called Nemeton. Their greatest hero, Vercingetorix, united the Gaulish tribes in 52 BC in one final magnificent stand against Julius Caesar at the Battle of Alesia. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like Gaul might survive as an independent civilization. But Rome won. Vercingetorix was captured, paraded through Rome in chains, and executed. Gaul became a Roman province. And yet, and this is the first great miracle of French history, the Gaulish identity did not die. It was absorbed, transformed, and eventually fused with Roman culture to create something entirely new. Latin became the language of Gaul. By the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire was crumbling under the weight of its own size and the relentless pressure of Germanic tribes pushing in from the north and east. Among these tribes, one group would define the future of Western Europe more than any other, the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic people who had been slowly settling in northern Gaul for decades, not as sudden conquerors, but as gradual infiltrators, often serving in the Roman army itself. And when Rome finally collapsed in the west in 476 AD, the Franks were already there, already organized, already powerful. Two great factions emerged, the Salian Franks in the north and the Ripuarian Franks along the Rhine. But it was one man from the Salian line who would forge them into a kingdom. His name was Clovis, and in 481 AD, at just 15 years old, he became king of the Franks. This teenage king would, within 30 years, conquer most of what is now modern France, defeat the Visigoths, unite the Frankish tribes under one crown, and, most critically, convert to Christianity. That conversion was not just a personal spiritual decision, it was a political masterstroke. But wait, the story is not over. Because 3 centuries after Clovis, a man emerged who would not merely rule France, he would rule Europe. His name was Charles, Carolus Magnus in Latin, Charlemagne. The Great Charles. And he was perhaps the single most important individual in the entire history of Western civilization. Born in 742 AD, Charlemagne inherited the Frankish kingdom from his father, Pepin the Short, and spent the next 4 decades doing something no one had done since the fall of Rome, reunifying Western Europe under a single ruler. In a series of brutal, relentless military campaigns, Charlemagne conquered the Saxons to the north, the Lombards in Italy, the Avars in the east, and pushed Frankish power all the way to modern-day Germany. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. But here's what made Charlemagne truly extraordinary. It was not just conquest, it was governance. At a time when most European rulers could barely read, Charlemagne built schools. He standardized weights and measures across his empire. He reformed the currency. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen, and launched what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, art, and culture after the darkness of the early medieval period. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head in St. But empires built by great men rarely survive their deaths, and Charlemagne's empire was no exception. When he died in 814 AD, his son, Louis the Pious, inherited a realm too vast and too complex to hold together. 3 of Louis's sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald fought a savage civil war that tore the Carolingian Empire apart. In 843 AD, they signed the Treaty of Verdun, one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements in European history. The empire was divided into three parts. The western portion, roughly modern France, went to Charles the Bald. The eastern portion, roughly modern Germany, went to Louis the German, and a middle strip went to Lothair. This treaty is considered the birth moment of France and Germany as separate nations, but the division brought devastating weakness. With no strong central authority, the Frankish kingdoms became prey to external attackers from three directions simultaneously: Muslim raiders from the south, Magyar horsemen from the east, and, most terrifyingly, the Vikings from the north. The solution France found was feudalism, a radical reorganization of society where local lords provided military protection in exchange for land and loyalty. Great nobles like the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Flanders, and the Duke of Burgundy became virtually independent rulers in their own territories. The king still existed, but his power was theoretical. Real power lay with the men who could actually defend their lands and people. And yet, and this is crucial, France survived. The language survived. The culture survived. The identity survived. Even the Vikings were eventually absorbed. In 911 AD, the Frankish king Charles the Simple gave a Viking chief named Rollo control of a territory in northern France in exchange for peace and conversion to Christianity. That territory became Normandy. Those Vikings became Normans. And 155 years later, those Normans, led by William the Conqueror, would invade England and change British history forever. In 987 AD, the Carolingian line effectively ended and a new dynasty took the throne, the Capetians. Hugh Capet, a powerful noble, was elected king by the French lords, beginning a dynasty that would rule France in one form or another for 800 years. The early Capetian kings were weak. Their actual territory, the Ile-de-France around Paris, was barely larger than a modern department. The great lords around them were more powerful than the king himself. But the Capetians had one enormous advantage: longevity and patience. Generation after generation, they expanded royal power slowly, methodically, consistently. They married strategically. They supported the church. They built alliances. And gradually, century by century, the French crown grew stronger. The greatest of these early kings was Philip II Augustus, who ruled from 1180 to 1223. Philip almost single-handedly transformed France from a feudal patchwork into a genuine kingdom. He defeated the English King John at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, one of the most decisive battles in French history, and seized vast English territories in France. The 12th and 13th centuries represent the high point of medieval French civilization, a period of extraordinary cultural, intellectual, and spiritual achievement. The Gothic cathedral, that soaring, light-flooded architectural miracle, was a French invention. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Notre Dame de Paris. These were not just churches. They were engineering feats that defied the understanding of their age, philosophical statements in stone about the relationship between humanity and the divine, and community achievements that took generations to complete. French literature flourished. The Chanson de Geste, epic poem celebrating the deeds of knights like Roland and Oliver, created the mythology of French heroism. The troubadours invented the concept of courtly love that would shape European poetry for centuries. And King Louis IX, St. Louis, who ruled from 1226 to 1270, became the model of the Christian king. Just, pious, personally humble, diplomatically skilled, and ruthlessly effective in war, he built the stunning Sainte-Chapelle in Paris to house what he believed were the relics of Christ's crown of thorns. He led 2 crusades to the Holy Land. He created legal reforms that laid the foundation of French law. When he died in 1270, he was canonized as a saint within 27 years, one of the fastest canonizations in church history. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. Within 4 years, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of France's entire population. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields went unplanted. Cathedrals stood half empty. The psychological trauma was unlike anything in human experience. People genuinely believed the world was ending. And then, before France could even begin to recover, came the 100 Years' War with England. The English crown had long claimed vast territories in France, and in 1337, King Edward III of England formally claimed the French throne itself. What followed was one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in medieval history. 116 years of intermittent warfare, plague, famine, and social collapse. The French suffered crushing defeats at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, battles where English longbowmen slaughtered the flower of French chivalry. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She was a peasant girl from the village of Domremy in eastern France. She was 17 years old. She could not read or write. She had never held a sword. And she claimed that the voices of saints St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, had told her that God had chosen her to drive the English from France and crown the French king at Reims. In 1429, she appeared before the Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned French king, and somehow, impossibly, convinced him to give her an army. In the space of 9 months, this teenage peasant girl lifted the siege of Orléans, won a series of stunning military victories, and escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned King Charles VII of France, with Joan standing beside him, holding her banner, weeping with joy. It was one of the most astonishing military and political turnarounds in history. Joan was later captured by Burgundian allies of the English, sold to the English, put on trial for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen on May 30th, 1431. She was 19 years old, but her mission was complete. Her martyrdom made her a symbol more powerful in death than she had ever been in life. The French found their identity again. The 16th and 17th centuries saw France transform from a medieval kingdom into the most powerful absolute monarchy in European history. The Renaissance arrived from Italy, bringing new ideas about art, science, humanism, and the nature of power. French kings embraced this transformation with enthusiasm. Francis Poulenc invited Leonardo da Vinci to live at the French court. The greatest genius of the age spent his final years in France. But it was the wars of religion, the savage conflict between French Catholics and Protestant Huguenots that lasted from 1562 to 1598, that truly defined this era. Tens of thousands died. On St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, Catholic mobs massacred an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Protestants in Paris alone, with similar killings across France. It was a national trauma that scarred the French psyche permanently. The resolution came through King Henry IV, a Protestant who converted to Catholicism to secure the throne, famously declaring, "Paris is worth a mass," and the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted religious toleration to Protestants. Henry IV was one of the most beloved kings in French history, a man of warmth, humor, and genuine care for his people. He was assassinated in 1610, but his grandson, Louis XIV, would take the absolute monarchy to its dizzying, spectacular extreme. Louis XIV ascended to the throne of France as an infant in 1643 and ruled for 72 years, the longest reign of any major monarch in European history. By the time he was done, he had made France the unchallenged superpower of Europe, built the most magnificent palace in the world, created the French cultural dominance that would last for centuries, and, almost incidentally, planted the seeds of the revolution that would destroy everything he built. His palace at Versailles was not merely a residence, it was a political instrument of genius. By moving the entire French court and government to Versailles, and requiring the great nobles of France to attend him there, Louis neutralized their political power completely. Aristocrats who might have been organizing rebellions in their provinces were instead competing to hold his candle at the lever, the morning ceremony of his rising. The Sun King, as he called himself, identifying with the god Apollo, the source of all light and warmth, created French cultural supremacy across Europe. French became the language of every European court from Madrid to Moscow. French fashion, French cooking, French architecture, French manners. Everything French became the standard of civilized life. The 18th century was the age of the French Enlightenment, the most radical intellectual movement in European history, and one of the most consequential in all of human history. Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Diderot, these were not merely philosophers, they were weapons. Voltaire attacked the church with devastating wit and sarcasm, arguing that organized religion was the enemy of reason and human progress. Rousseau declared that sovereignty resided in the people, not the king, a statement of breathtaking radicalism in an age of absolute monarchy. Montesquieu analyzed governments and argued for the separation of powers that would directly inspire the American Constitution. And Diderot edited the Encyclopédie, a monumental 28-volume project that attempted to systematically catalog all human knowledge and subtly undermine every traditional authority in French society. These ideas spread across France's educated classes with extraordinary speed. Coffeehouses and salons hummed with dangerous conversations. The spark came in 1789. On July 14th of that year, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison that had become the hated symbol of royal tyranny. They freed its prisoners, they tore it apart stone by stone, and they carried its governor's head through the streets on a pike. The French Revolution had begun. What followed was one of the most dramatic, violent, and world-altering episodes in human history. A tornado of ideas and blood that destroyed the old world of kings and aristocrats and church privilege and tried to build an entirely new civilization on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, issued in August 1789, proclaimed that all men are born free and equal, that the source of all sovereignty resides in the nation, and that the law must be the same for all. It was the founding document of the modern world. In 1792, France declared itself a republic. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was guillotined in the Place de la Révolution before a crowd of thousands. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed him to the guillotine 9 months later. The revolution then turned upon itself in the terror of 1793 to 1794, a period of mass executions in which the revolutionary government, led by the Committee of Public Safety under Maximilien Robespierre, executed tens of thousands of people deemed enemies of the revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just 1 year after France had purchased the island from Genoa. He was French by 1 year, and yet no one in history would define what it means to be French. The combination of military genius, intellectual brilliance, administrative vision, and consuming ambition, more completely than the short, intense, extraordinary man. Napoleon rose through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army with terrifying speed, demonstrating a talent for military strategy that his contemporaries literally could not comprehend. In 1799, he staged a coup and seized power as first consul of France. In 1804, he crowned himself emperor, placing the crown on his own head in Notre Dame Cathedral with the Pope watching, to make clear that he owed his power to no one but himself. What Napoleon did in the next decade beggars description. He fought over 60 major battles and lost only 7. He conquered most of continental Europe. He placed his brothers on the thrones of Holland, Spain, Naples, and Westphalia. He reorganized France's entire legal system into the Napoleonic Code, a masterpiece of rational legal thinking that is still the basis of law in France, Louisiana, Quebec, and dozens of other countries today. He built roads, bridges, and canals. He founded the lycée system of secondary education. He established the Bank of France. He reconciled France with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801. But Napoleon's genius was also his destruction. His ambition had no natural limit. The invasion of Russia in 1812, with 600,000 men marching east, ended in catastrophic disaster. Only 100,000 came back. The coalition of European powers defeated him at Leipzig in 1813 and again at Waterloo in 1815. He died in exile on the remote island of St. Helena in 1821, slowly poisoned by the damp and the humiliation. But his legacy was permanent. The 19th century in France was a bewildering carousel of political systems. After Napoleon, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. First Louis XVI, then Charles VI. Charles VI was overthrown in the July Revolution of 1830, replaced by the constitutional monarch Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was overthrown in the Revolution of 1848, which established the Second Republic. The Second Republic's president, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great Napoleon, staged a coup in 1851 and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III of the Second Empire. Napoleon III was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, captured by the Prussians at Sedan, and deposed. The Commune of Paris, a radical workers' government, briefly seized control of the capital before being drowned in blood by the French army. And finally, the Third Republic was established, the government that, through all its instability and parliamentary chaos, would actually survive until 1940. Through all of this political turbulence, France remained a cultural and intellectual powerhouse. Paris, in the 19th century, was the art capital of the world. Impressionism, Monet, Renoir, Degas, revolutionized how human beings saw and painted light. Victor Hugo wrote Les Miserables and Notre Dame de Paris, defining the French literary imagination. Gustave Eiffel built his extraordinary iron tower for the 1889 World's Fair, a structure that Parisians initially despised and eventually made the most recognized symbol on earth. France entered the First World War in 1914 as the largest land power in Europe. By 1918, it had lost 1.4 million soldiers dead, a proportion of population that no modern country has come close to replicating in the Western Front, the most hellish killing ground in human history, ran largely through French soil. The Battle of Verdun alone, in 1916, killed 700,000 men in 10 months of industrial slaughter for a few miles of meaningless mud. France won the war, but at a cost that hollowed out an entire generation and left the nation psychologically shattered. 20 years later, it happened again. In May-June 1940, Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg shattered the French army in 6 weeks, one of the most humiliating military collapses in modern history. France was occupied. The collaborationist Vichy government made shameful compromises with the Nazi regime, including the deportation of 77,000 French Jews to the death camps. But Free France, led by the impossible, magnificent Charles de Gaulle from London, refused to accept defeat. The French resistance fought. The Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, on French soil, and France was liberated. Paris was freed on August 25, 1944. De Gaulle walked the length of the Champs-Élysées in a triumph that was partly theater and entirely necessary. France needed to believe that it had liberated itself. After the war, de Gaulle shaped the Fifth Republic, the political system France still uses today, creating a powerful executive presidency specifically designed to provide the stable, decisive leadership that had been so catastrophically absent in 1940. Today, France is the world's seventh largest economy, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, and the most visited country on Earth, welcoming over 90 million tourists a year to its extraordinary accumulation of history, art, food, and civilization. Emmanuel Macron, who came to power in 2017 as the youngest French president in history, represents the latest attempt to navigate France's eternal tension between authority and liberty, between the demands of a European and global order, and the fierce particularity of French identity. France faces real challenges: economic inequality, the integration of immigrant communities, the rise of populist politics, questions about its role in a world where American and Chinese power increasingly dominate. The Yellow Vest protests of 2018-2019, ordinary working people blocking highways and roundabouts across the country to protest economic injustice, were a reminder that the spirit of 1789 is not dead. And when French people feel that the system is unjust, they take to the streets. They always have. They always will. But here is what 12 centuries of French history teach us. France has faced worse, much worse. It survived Roman conquest and Frankish invasion. It survived the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. It survived the Terror and Napoleon's collapse and 2 German occupations. Each time, the language survived. The culture survived. The fierce, infuriating, magnificent insistence on liberty, dignity, and the right to argue survived. From Charlemagne's Christmas coronation in 800 AD to Macron's Élysée Palace today, the same extraordinary civilization persists, wounded, transformed, renewed, but never extinguished. The story of France is ultimately the story of humanity's refusal to be permanently defeated, and that story, trust me, is not over.